I'm the Center for Environmental Farming Systems liaison for research, outreach, and education. John?
Hello, everybody. I am an agriculture extension agent in Durham County. I have a focus more on small, urban, limited resource farms, but I cover agriculture across the board here. And most of the farmers and the producers that I work with are producing local food crops. So that's something that we'll talk a good bit about today when the time comes. Thank you all for being here.
Great. So we did mention that this is being recorded, and everybody that signed up for the webinar will get a copy of the recording. If you would also like a copy of the slide deck, you can email John or I, and we can send that out to you. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Um, the first thing that I want to clarify is that, a garden can be many different things. How do you define a garden? A garden can be pots on your back porch. Maybe you have a large yard that you can, have a nice square garden in your backyard. Maybe you have in-ground raised beds or a high tunnel. Maybe you're just planting food around your existing landscape, or delving into something like square foot gardening. So, it's up to you. Do you want to grow herbs? Are you interested in perennials? Do you have space for row crops, or are you doing pots or raised beds? So you're defining a garden, and you want to set yourself up for success. So planning is really key. So we're talking about having a notebook and a calendar and a solid plan before you start doing anything. So you're going to want to decide, what do you want to grow? What do you want to grow? What kind of space do you have? So how can you meet your goals? What time of year are you planting what it is you want to plant? Say, I want to grow corn and beans. Like, what time of year are you planting those things? When will it be harvested? How will you harvest it? What are your frost dates so you know when to plant? And then thinking about, what kind of infrastructure are you going to need? If you want to grow pole beans, you're going to need a trellis. Do you need fencing? Do you need really tall fencing? Do you have deer? Do you need small fencing? You have rabbits. So thinking about some initial sunk costs, budgeting and time management. So we're talking about the costs that you're going to invest to get started. Do you have land? Do you need to purchase some land? What is your crop production area? Is it your backyard, or are you going to rent some space somewhere? What kind of soil do you have? Are you going to need to import some soil? Do you have what kind of amendments do you going to need to add to your soil? You want to decide whether you want to do seeds or transplants. Now there's pros and cons to both. It really depends on the scale of what you're doing. And if you have specific, like, varietal desires, or like disease protection, if you want to buy specific seeds, or if you're just going to grow 5 tomato plants and you want to buy some transplants. So if you're going to grow, 3 rows of tomatoes and you need 60 plants, it would be more cost effective to buy seeds and start your own transplants. You're going to want to budget in amendments, nutrients, and then think about uh, where your water is going to come from and how you're going to water. We also want to consider what kind of tools we're going to need. Do we have hand tools? Are we talking a walk behind tiller? Are we talking a tractor? Are we just talking some shovels? Um, Maintenance for these tools, storage for your tools. And then you really want to think about time investment, right? So we're setting ourselves up for success. I have a sizable garden at my mother-in-law's place, but it's 15 minutes north. And I learned early on that I can only plant specific things up there because I don't have the time to go up there every day. So something that needs a lot of maintenance, or a lot of, like, sort of when it's harvest time, continual harvesting, I can't grow up there. So especially if you're organic gardening, you really want to be able to walk out and look at your plants every day. You want to be able to go and pick off the squash bugs. So think about the time that you have for the maintenance, and how much you can realistically take care of. Is it just going to be you doing the labor? Do you have children? Are you going to hire labor? Maybe it's a community garden. What kind of infrastructure do you need? Structures and fences, that sort of thing. So we're talking about, sitting around at your desk or kitchen table in the wintertime with a notebook and planning out what it is you want to do, how can you meet that goal, and what are you going to need to purchase and or build to accomplish it well. Let's see. I think I'm gonna volley it over to John now to do a couple of these slides.
Great. Thank you, Melissa. So, in the context of planning and starting a farmer garden, um, figuring out what you want to do and how you want to do it and why is a pretty tall order, but really defining your purpose is very important. So there's a lot of reasons somebody might get into producing food crops. We're also talking about specialty crops and other things, but generally with a focus on food. Are you going to be growing it for yourself? Are you hoping to support people in your community or institutions in your community or offer opportunities for education? Or there's a lot of things that you can do. For many farms, the purpose is profit. It's how you feed your family with the set of tools that you have. So income for many is definitely a priority. Other folks are more interested in the currency of, community well-being and education, or ecological restoration. If you farm in a regenerative capacity, you can do some pretty cool things alongside Mother Nature. So when you think about planning and defining that vision, being mindful of scale can be pretty important. I see, more than I would like, I see people who would have been great farmers, but miss or underestimated some element of it, or scaled way too big, way too fast. So being mindful of how large of an operation you might want to have, how involved, how deeply or widely involved you are with a bunch of other things, or a bunch of new agricultural endeavors. And then being mindful that you can absolutely aim big, but aiming big does not make starting small a bad idea necessarily. So to move forward a little bit, I also want to kind of talk about how sustainability and community are uh, really relevant to what one might be trying to achieve with a farm. If you're mindful of principles like maintaining and protecting soil health, you can, if you've attended any of our other presentations, you know that good soil health is a really good opportunity to not to have to buy a bunch of chemicals and other things that would imitate the conditions of good soil health. So that's a good priority. Minimizing your ecological footprint, recycling, composting, those are priorities that you could choose to have on your farm. This picture here is a picture of a few years ago from outside our Durham Extension office, where we've just got a bunch of folks kind of enjoying the community garden and enjoying one another's company. Lastly, and a really big one, is resilience, or what some might say self-reliance. Creating something that can help feed you and your family if a supply chain gets disrupted. That not if, but whenever it continues to get warm here, being mindful of things that you can continue to grow here in the future. You can do a lot with a farmer garden. Um, once you've got not that place, but that place in your mind, that place you want to get to, then being really mindful of environmental conditions at the place is a really important thing to do. You could use any of these things I'm about to say. You could be advantageous or disadvantageous. So if you've got trees and you need shade, and maybe you've got crops that require less sunlight, trees could be a good thing. Maybe you've got some crops in one area and it's really windy and the wind is damaging your grapevines or something like that. You could put a windbreak of trees on the other side to, remedy that. But generally speaking, within agriculture, airflow is a good thing, circulation is a good thing. So if you put too many trees around what you're trying to grow, you likely could create stagnant conditions where pest populations or pathogens might thrive. So, like anything in nature, including agriculture, finding a balance is really key. Another big one with trees, though, is if you are putting plants in the ground, it is a generally good idea to if the tree is 100 feet tall, don't put the plant within a 100-foot radius of the tree. Not necessarily because the tree is going to fall on the crops, but casting more shade than would be beneficial could absolutely happen. Slope of the land is a big thing. Again, I already mentioned grapes, but if you've got crops where cold, cold, foggy air, might damage the fruit. If you've got a slope, that cold, foggy air will roll down and away, which is important for a handful of crops around here. We could talk a lot about water drainage. You all would probably know to not plant or walk around in areas that actively flood. And we also want to be mindful of soil and preventing erosion because that land that we bought or leased or whatever is probably our biggest asset for farming and gardening. Um, I want to consider the layout of the site and how one might design their space. Let's see. Melissa, would you mind advancing one slide for me? Let's see. Okay, thank you. So if if you're laying out a say a garden, we'll say a garden in this instance. And it's nowhere, your crops are nowhere near a garden hose, then you're going to have to either drag a hose around and over your crops, or you're going to have to carry, hand water everything. That can really be a pain, and consider the same with location of maybe your tool shed or your, where you're keeping your machinery. Um, when you're considering that layout, it's also good to be mindful of orientation of the garden beds or the row crops, where you have everything in regard to where you're going to be moving and where you're going to be moving your equipment and machinery and tools. That's a bigger deal than some people might think as they're getting into this. Also being mindful that some plants really grow well in close proximity to one another and have a lot of mutual benefits, whereas other plants do not. This picture looks like tomatoes and basil. Maybe it's Thai basil, I'm not sure, but those two things really grow well together, and they like to help each other in a kind of botanical context. Also being mindful of, what kind of plants do you want to put in the hard work of establishing an orchard? Do you want, to dig a bunch of huge holes, plant a bunch of things that require a lot of active pruning and maintenance early on, in the hope that 4 or 5 or more years from now you might have some fruit? Or do you want to plant a bunch of stuff at the beginning of every season, wait till it dies, plant a bunch of other stuff? There's a lot of different ways that you could consider different plants in where you're putting trees or crops or whatever around around the site. I've got a couple more or a few more before I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa, but I want to talk about also the convenience for the people on the site. Um, I harp a lot on dense planting strategies. It's kind of like historically like a European method to try to plant things as densely as possible on a smaller space to maximize the output. That's a good idea. But also, if you're going to hate being out there, then they're not going to get maintained well. If you can't walk between your rows of tomatoes without having plant limbs drag all over you, maybe you like that. Maybe you're like me and you are probably okay with that. But consider your need for space. You want to be comfortable in this place as well. So be mindful of that. Also, I mentioned tools, equipment, water, fertilizers. There's a lot of things that on a farm or garden you might want to have nearby. And also capitalizing on the sunlight, that either the sunlight or the land. I don't know what's one of the greater currencies for a farmer, but if you've got flat land and you've got sunlight, I would not be planting on sloped land or shady area, if I did have those. So crops are going to need water in addition to sunlight and soil. So around, in North Carolina, especially during warm seasons, pretty heavy and regular irrigation is, usually necessary for many of the crops that we grow. Sometimes more than an inch of water a week if it's warm. Um, Consider the source of your water. Is it city water? Is it well water? Does the chemical contents of that water do the chemical contents of that water align with the fertility needs, of the crops that you're trying to grow? If you've got water that's totally alkaline and you're really trying to adjust your pH and, acidify it or whatever you might be trying to do, the wrong water could sabotage you. So it's important to know your local, if you're in Durham, the Durham County Department of Soil and Water has some really good resources with rainwater collection, water management, things like that. I'll say first, they usually know more than I do about water, so use all your resources if you can. Irrigate properly. If you can help it, don't spray water all over the tops of your plants. Even though it rains in nature, the less time those leaves and stems can spend being wet, the greater chance they have of avoiding, mildew and fungus and other things like that. So water the ground, using drip tape, soaker hoses, hand watering, but pointing at the bottom of the plant is what I do if it's a small garden. So, consider your water. I want to talk quickly about sunlight as well, because grouping plants with similar requirements is usually a good idea. If you've got an area that gets a ton of sun, putting your, tomatoes and your peppers and your squash and everything that needs a ton of sunlight, to, relatively nearby one another in that area would probably be a good thing to do. And then inversely, some crops don't require quite so much sunlight. And one of the reasons that a number of brassicas, things in the kale, broccoli family, grow well into the fall and winter is because they are generally pretty fine with low levels of sunlight. I want to also mention some strategies for dealing with pests and diseases. You might want to consider just how holistic your operation might be. If you use, an integrated pest management strategy, you can generally, hit the pests with the cultural, mechanical, and biological solutions before you have to pull out the chemicals. Um, for some people, the chemicals may be preferable. I'm not here to vilify you for that. I'm just here to suggest, healthier alternatives if possible. If you can suppress your weeds with mulch or, wood chips between rows, or, there's pros and cons to all these different options, but if you can engage in some environmentally friendly practices, those weeds and pests and diseases might be a little bit more controllable. I talked about planting densely. The downside of planting densely is that reduced airflow and, greater stagnant humidity, which might create more disease with lack of spacing. And then lastly, if we're supporting the pollinators, they will do a pretty good job of supporting us. So if you can avoid spraying any pesticides on plants in bloom, as well as having plants that flower and bloom throughout different seasons of the year, you will attract as a whole, you will attract a lot of good pollinators to the growing space, which will ultimately benefit all the other stuff you have around too. The last couple things I have before I turn it over to Melissa, I said that earlier, but I mean it this time, is you want to be mindful of the planting seasons, which you can plant during what time of year. We'll touch on this concept a few times right throughout this presentation. And I also have to mention that you can plant in some instances with some success, maybe little success, outside of a targeted growing season. If you have season extension, capabilities like a greenhouse or something like that, there's a lot of different options. Um, but we want to plant the right plant at the right time, and certainly we don't want to gamble with planting before the frost date for warm season crops. My last thing that I want to point you guys to, while I have the microphone for a minute, is essentially just This was put together by the Master Gardener Volunteer Program. It's just such a good slide. I had to borrow it for this. But essentially, and generally speaking, for cool season crops, if you're planting, between February and April, you'll probably be harvesting, between May and August. Warm season crops, you're planting after that final frost, maybe late April, May, all the way through high summer, and then harvesting from mid to late summer. And then lastly, you can apply the same logic. You're planting when it's not too cold, and then you're harvesting, either when it's not too cold or when it's warm enough for that particular plant to grow. So we'll retouch on these points again shortly, but back to Melissa.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, John. This is a guide, planting guide that I really like. It's a little dated, but I still really like it. It'll tell you what time of year to plant what you're interested in, whether you're going to direct seed that or use a transplant, seeding depths, plant spacing, that sort of thing. And then really key, I think, is days to maturity. So it will tell you from your planting, days to maturity. So you'll know that, maybe you can follow that with something else. You know that if you're planting something on April 15th, when you're going to be harvesting it. It's a really good piece of information, the days to maturity, and really help with planning. I'll talk a little bit more in a second about multiple use of space, and that really comes in key. This is another one with another planting guide from Cooperative Extension, also really valuable. It shows the turquoise is the eastern part of the state, the orange is the Piedmont, and the purple is the western part of the state. So taking beans as an example, it also gives you days to maturity or days to harvest, the distance in between plants. And if you're in the Piedmont, you can begin planting your bush beans April 15th. And you can plant all the way through July. And then given the days to maturity, you'll know when you will be harvesting that particular plant. John's going to talk more about this, but very common in North Carolina, our crops that we plant in the spring and the fall are often the same. And often those crops might grow better in the fall. Things like broccoli, things that might bolt if they have, a really hot early summer. They're going to be much happier as it gets cooler rather than growing into the heat. I want to talk a little bit about transplants. So transplants don't have to be scary. And it's a trade-off really, depending on how much you want to grow. But if you're doing transplants, you're going to need a calendar. You're going to say, okay, I want to plant these tomatoes on May 20th, and then you're going to want to count backwards 6 to 8 weeks. So there's varying, most of them are, 6 to 8 weeks. Broccoli can be shorter. Your cole crops like broccoli and cabbage, it says 5 to 7 weeks. What it doesn't tell you though is that week that you're going to need for germination, and then also that week you're going to need for hardening off. So hardening off is the process of taking those transplants that have been coddled under their grow lights in a nice warm environment and taking them outside during the day so that they can get used to the wind and the sun, and the temperature change, and then taking them back in at night. So after a week of doing that, they're not shocked you plant them out in the garden. So you need to have budget in your time a week of hardening off. It says 3 to 4 weeks, allow 3 to 4 weeks for cucumbers or melons. You can also really direct seed cucumbers or melons. To 8 weeks for our Solanaceae, our eggplant, tomatoes, and peppers. So again, pick your target date and then count backwards. Common planting dates, John's going to go into more detail about this. I'll just say that our spring and fall crops tend to be our cole crops, spinaches and lettuces, root crops like beets and rutabagas, and herbs such as cilantro and parsley. And then the summer is what we think of our summer crops are the Solanaceae family, really. The tomatoes, eggplants, and peppers. Our summer squashes like zucchinis and crookneck squashes. Our winter squashes, name is a little confusing. Our winter squashes like butternut and acorn and kabocha, red curry, my favorite. Those are planted in the summer and then harvested in the fall. Pumpkins as well. They grow all summer long. And then corn and pole beans or bush beans are summer planting dates. I want to talk about the difference between open pollinated and hybrid seed. If you joined us on our last webinar, I talked about this, but it can be confusing for people. Um, and this information will help inform your decision about what kind of seed you want to buy. So open pollinated means natural pollination by insects or wind, are transferring the pollen. These seeds are true to type. So that means that the offspring is going to resemble the parent. So you can save this seed. These plants, like heirloom varieties, are often adapted to local conditions. So if it's open pollinated, you can save the seed. Hybrid seed involves human intervention, not GMO, just traditional plant breeding, cross-pollinating two varieties with a specific trait in mind. Often that specific trait is disease resistance. Now, this is really valuable in the Southeast where we have some really brutal summers, you know, optimal conditions for plant disease, hot, humid, lots of rain. So you can find hybrid seed that says excellent southeastern disease package, strong resistance to late blight, intermediate resistance to verticillium wilt. And I've planted a lot of hybrid seed, and it's true. This disease resistance is very valuable, but this seed is more expensive, and you cannot save this seed because it's hybrid. The offspring will not necessarily be the same as the parent. So it's a trade-off in what you want to do. I often buy hybrid seed. This year I wanted to save seed, so I bought all open pollinated seed. A plug for So True Seed in North Carolina. They have all open pollinated seed. So if you want to save seed, build a little seed catalog, a little chest, that's a great choice. If you really want we'll see how it goes this summer. I've always bought my tomatoes at least hybrid, so I get that disease resistance. But this year I'm going with heirloom varieties, and we'll see how that goes. So that's the difference between open pollinated and hybrid. Starting transplants at home, it doesn't have to be complicated. You just need space. This was my kitchen counter a few years ago. You would need some sort of trays, even these little 6-packs, grow lights, a seed mat, heating mat can also really help get the transplant started. The the left and the middle, that was my setup a couple years ago, and it worked relatively well, although it did take up space on the kitchen counter. This year I splurged and bought myself a 3-tiered little shelving unit at Walmart. It was like $30. And then these lights that are really cool. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but the adjustable height with these lights. This is in my laundry room, which is really small, right next to the heating duct. It was nice and toasty warm in there. It worked really well. As the transplants got bigger, I just raised the light up. So that worked really well for me. And really, it's a trade-off on if you want a specific kind of seed and you're planting a whole lot of something and it makes sense to buy a seed packet. Often, if you're looking online and picking out a specific variety that you want, the delivery costs for seeds can be a little ridiculous for the cost of the seed. So think about going in with a buddy, also seed saving with a buddy. I often buy seed with my sister, so we split the cost. So things to consider. Potting mix. Now, if you're doing transplants, you're going to make sure that you buy a potting mix. You don't want potting soil. You don't want garden soil. This potting mix is soilless. It does not contain any soil. Soil is heavier, it's denser. It does not work well in the little transplant trays. So you're going to be looking for something like this. It says potting mix. This is an organic one. Miracle Grow always has fertilizer in it. Your transplants do not need fertilizer. In those little trays, they are not going to need any fertilizer for those 6 to 8 weeks that they're there. I mentioned this. There's a lot of different recipes online for making your own. These are the components that are in a soilless mix, and they're there for a reason. The perlite, I think we had a picture earlier that showed the transplant tray, and you always see those little bits of white rock. That's perlite, that's expanded volcanic rock. That provides the drainage. It's lightweight. It holds air. It doesn't retain any water. So you have to mix the perlite with vermiculite, which is a form of mica, and that retains water, but it doesn't provide any aeration. So if you're mixing perlite and vermiculite and then also sand, which helps improve drainage and aeration, but doesn't hold any water. So together, like in nature, mixes work really well. So a soilless potting mix would contain these sorts of things. You really just want a media that can hold soil and water and but not be dense in that little cell so that your seedling can grow. Let's see, that's we're gonna turn it back over to John.
Yeah, so to kind of tie in a number of the things that we've said, we want to be conscious of, are we direct seeding, are we transplanting, what season is it? But we also want to be conscious of what are some of the array of options that we have this time, at various times a year, but in this place. So throughout regions of North Carolina, and obviously it's a little bit colder and warmer in different places, but some of the general warm season crops that are going to grow around here, I'd love to just kind of, let's see, would you mind advancing one slide? I want to
Right.
point to a number of the different options that we might have, and this is far from exhaustive, but you can grow really, really well a lot of things either for processing, for home consumption, for selling at markets, everything, tomatoes, cucumbers, squash, corn, a lot of the big southern summer warm crops. There's also, if you have a little land and you're interested in growing some things that might be, a little less local, but maybe more distributed, depends on, again, your scale and your goals. But a lot of folks in this region have luck with peanuts and soybeans, especially as you get a little farther out east. And then considering things that are just really going to grow pretty well throughout most of the state or much of the state. Melons are great, especially in central and eastern North Carolina. Grapes grow really well in the south. A lot of different options, far from everything. Um, but I also want to give you guys some ideas of what might grow as well in the cool season. So a lot of different crops uh, not only have varying temperature requirements, but also varying sunlight requirements. And again, depending upon the time of year, some things around here can grow, in and out of different seasons. For instance, you could probably grow decent kale around here this time of year. But it will continue to thrive and will likely be a little bit sweeter and a little bit healthier as the weather gets a little bit cooler. A lot of things in that plant family grow really well as cool season crops around here. Additionally, there are a lot of really good, productive root and tuber crops, as for a general basic botanical lesson. If whenever something is underground, the prize piece of that plant in this instance, the carrot or the beet would be the root. It's not going to be as susceptible to cold weather damage outside of that, slightly warmer ground as summer crops like tomatoes or squash would be. So things that are growing in the ground, and have access to more of that stored warmth, are going to grow pretty well in the cooler seasons. I did not mention, but growing in the ground does also include onions and garlic, a number of, bulbs. And then just to kind of not ignore some of the other outlying things that grow really well in the wintertime around here, or in the fall and the spring, depending, maybe into the winter, depends on what you got. But lettuces, spinach, a lot of peas grow really well around here. So that was a fairly long list, but far from everything that farmers around here can grow successfully. Um, Before you plant any of those types of seeds, you're going to be mindful of preparing your growing areas for planting. A big thing that I harp on a lot is the effort that, especially on a smaller scale, the effort that you expend um, removing weeds before you plant. Uh, is massive. If you have a high tunnel, if you've got a 30 by 60 high tunnel, and you're prepping for planting that season and you leave a handful of weeds here and there, um, it's very likely that those handful of weeds will become many, many more weeds later, and the extra effort now to expend pulling them would be a fraction of the effort that you would expend later. So on a larger scale, mechanical removal isn't always feasible. So, some folks will burn the weeds down with an herbicide. Some folks might smother them, probably on a smaller scale than a larger scale, but you can, with cardboard, or some folks will use like a hugel culture setup, which we'll maybe talk about that at another time. But if you can smother the weeds with some type of carbon heavy matter like wood or cardboard or something, that's a possible way of getting that area prepped. Um, and then once you've gotten all the weeds gone before you plant, you're going to want to be mindful of a strategy for tillage, which your first option is conventional tillage. Your grandfather's rototiller, or any other comparable piece of machinery illustrates this pretty well.
Or
On a
grandmothers.
farm, what's that?
Or grandmothers.
Yeah, 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 yeah. In my case as well. Um, so you know, on a larger scale, you might see a plow or discs doing something like this. But a tiller and a garden bed, that's traditional. It's not. I'm not here to say it's good or bad. But there are pros and cons. You can get most of the weeds gone pretty early, although there is a fertile, bed for weeds to go into. The soil is going to be ready for seed germination a little bit quicker. Easier to put some of those soil amendments or fertilizers. But at that point, you've got no living roots within the soil, no aggregation, no clumps keeping the soil together. And ultimately, you've eradicated almost all of the healthy microbial life, which does a really good job of keeping you from having to buy those extra fertilizers and stuff later. So it's a give and a take. I have loved ones who will, do any of the variety of things that I'm about to tell you, as far as tillage, but conventional tillage still very common, some pros, some cons. Um, Speaking next a little more broadly about conservation tillage, that is a system where you're trying to leave the organic matter, leave the residue of the crops. You harvest the ears of corn, you lay the stalks down and let them decompose and turn into soil, which, you're keeping those roots in the soil, you're keeping the exchanges between the plant and the soil life going, you're not ripping it out and tearing it up. Um, Very good way to prevent, and there's a few different things that fall into the conservation tillage category. I'll talk a little bit more about strip till and no till shortly. But generally speaking, conservation tillage, you're taking better care of the soil. You're gonna retain that water. You're going to prevent the soil from eroding. You're retaining organic matter, which will decompose and give the microbes something to eat. Um, I talk in every single one of these about saving the fuel and the labor, by choosing the more holistic option as opposed to the more, industrial option. Again, find a balance that works for you, but you will um, save some fuel potentially in this method. Drawbacks, depending upon your method, might be some specialized equipment, probably not as good for a very small scale. And then, germination and weed control might not be quite as effective. No-till. No-till is something that a lot of people are into. I think it's pretty cool. If it does require the correct equipment in order to make it work for you. But no-till, not using a tiller at all, essentially only drilling little holes for you to plant your seeds, um, is really great for the soil health, really great for labor. You do again have to have the specialized equipment, but you're taking care of ecological elements and processes optimally this way. Um, Not necessarily as ideal for germination timing because you're not getting all that warmth incorporated, all that natural sunlight and stuff that deep underground in the soil doesn't naturally see, because that's not how Mother Nature works, um, does make it a little bit less ideal for quick germination. Um, and then lastly, kind of a medium between all of these things, strip tillage, which is like where you're tilling up, and again, specialized equipment. This picture that I've got here is, I can't remember what state, but it's another state's extension service. Might be us, I don't know. I should have saved, I have it written down somewhere. But either way, that is a very small strip tilling piece of equipment. Usually the ones I've seen are typically wider and do more rows at a time. But in order to be this precise, you talk about precision agriculture, you really need either GPS guidance or some type of equipment that aligns your rows beautifully, or else it'll kind of be a disaster. Strip tillage just tills up the area where you're planting seeds and keeps all of the benefits, well, many of the benefits of no-till practices between those little rows. So it's strip tilling is pretty cool, but again, unless you're have a sizable upfront investment and a pretty good market plan, I would probably not be getting into strip tillage until I reach some of those thresholds. Um, and I'm going to hot potato this back to Melissa now to talk about a few types of garden beds.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I was answering a question. Before I say that, someone was asking about growing a summer vegetable in total shade. And there's the NC State Plant Toolbox. Is that what it's called, John? Where you if you go online, I'm talking to
Yes.
Lori, there's an
Yeah,
excellent resource for just that. And I think it's called the Plant Toolbox.
I'm
And
putting it
you
in the
put
chat
in
right
the
now.
parameters like, oh, I have total shade, sweat soil, blah, blah, blah. And it'll spit out like what can you grow in that condition. So Lori, try the plant toolbox. I think I'm saying it correctly.
It's the NC Extension Gardener. Excuse me, NC Extension Gardener Plant Toolbox. It's run through the Master Gardener program,
Okay.
and the Find a Plant feature enables you to add numerous filters ranging from level of soil compaction to amount of sunlight to different type of pest or animal pressure to seasonality to you name it. You tell the conditions that you have, and it will give you a long list of appropriate plants. So if
Okay.
I can
Great.
offer any guidance there, I'm happy to.
Yeah, someone put the link in the chat box for us. So I'm gonna go through these a little. We're getting close on time, not too bad. Okay. So garden beds. In-ground garden beds with our traditional rows. The pros, it's low cost, minimal materials. You're not building any boxes, less initial setup. It's easy to scale if you have like easier for if you're scaling up to really large plots. You just have these garden rows. Um, the cons, it depends on the kind of soil you have. If you're going to be doing this, you want to have a soil that's drains well. Um, it can be labor intensive because it can be prone to compaction or weeds. You're going to have to figure out a way that works for you to deal with the weeds on a larger scale. Less control of the soil. And then you have less control of the soil in which the plants are grown because you're just going with native soil and planting into the rows. So this can work for a lot of people depending on where you are. Um, Maybe especially in the eastern part of the state, but maybe in the Piedmont or the mountains, this would be a little more difficult. And we also have to take in consideration the slope of the land. Now raised beds are something you're going to construct. These are contained raised beds. So you're building a structure, cinder blocks or wood. Um, you want to keep them not wider than I'd say 3 to 4 feet because you want to be able to reach across into the middle. The pros of a raised bed is that you can really control the soil that you're putting into it. So you have really good drainage. You're adding this soil on top of a native soil, and so you can really control what you're putting into it. Now, a lot of people think that they need a lot of soil in this raised bed, but these plants are going to grow in this raised bed soil, and their roots can go down into the native soil. So it doesn't have to be 6 feet deep, right? You have a couple of feet, say you have 2 or 3 feet, of the raised bed soil, and then the roots, if they need to, they will enter the native soil. Even if you put hardware cloth on the bottom of the beds, which can be really useful if you have moles in your yard, hardware cloth will keep the moles out, but the roots can still get through that hardware cloth. Yes, it's tidy and it's organized, and then so you're removing having to worry about um, problems with the native soil. The cons are it's higher cost to build, and then you have to bring in soil. And then the soil is also going to dry out more quickly. Just like if you have pots, in pots, the soil dries out really quickly, almost daily. Raised beds, you're going to want to make sure that you keep those watered because, we're not in the deeper soil that is able to hold a lot of water. Another thing that I would put is, I built mine with wood initially, and you don't want to use treated wood. So you're going to be replacing those boards every couple of years. The second time I painted them, and that lasted a little bit longer. I have seen the cinder blocks, and I think that's a really good idea. It's a little harder to set up and deal with, but then you're not replacing boards that rot or end up getting bowed. Um, so uncontained raised beds. So this is something that I practice, soil mounded into beds without a frame. So, if you have a walk behind tiller or even, you loosen up the soil and then you have like shovels or hose, you can create a raised bed, and that really increases the drainage. So especially here in the Piedmont, the raised beds really help increase drainage and alleviate some compaction. So the pros for an uncontained raised bed: cheaper, quicker to establish, really improves draining and warming up in the springtime, and less chance of compaction. The cons are is that you're probably over time going to be reforming these beds, and they're a little less durable or tidy. But this is a really good option if it sort of pairs row cropping with a raised bed. And ideally you'd have permanent raised beds, right? So you'd have permanent walking paths and these raised beds that you're not traipsing across for several years. And then really you're just removing the weeds from those raised beds. You're not worrying about the paths, whether you till in between the beds or you're laying some wheat straw down or mulch or paper. So this is a good option for small to medium sized or even really large gardens. What number are we on now? So container gardens also a great idea, depending on your space. Plants grown in pots, bags, buckets. Tires. You can grow plants just about anywhere. So a container garden, great for patios or balconies, or if you have really poor soil, you might consider container gardens. So you are bringing in soil to fill these. You're not putting soil from your yard in these. You're using you know, potting soil because you're gonna need the aeration, and then you have to think about and the drainage, and then you have to think about nutrients going into those because you're not really having a lot of inherent nutrients. Very portable, very accessible. The cons could be the limited soil volume and limited root space. So if you're going to do pots, you want like one tomato in a pot. You're not going to want to put 2 or 3 tomatoes in a pot. But it's great for things like maybe lettuces or carrots. You can get a lot of that in. Container gardens are great for cut and come again lettuces. I put peppers in pots on my back porch because I'm limited by my sunlight out front in my raised beds, but my back porch gets sun all day long. So I put my peppers in pots in the back. Coming up with the pots and then the potting soil, that's a cost that you need to consider. Not scalable for significant production farming, certainly, and you have to buy the soil, like I said. Um, Other considerations, you should keep the plants in similar light and water requirements in the same area. That makes a lot of sense. So So creative use of space. So I wanted to talk about that. If you have um, even your raised bed, say you have one raised bed, ideally you'd have like three, right? Because then you can have a rotation with your plant families. You know, you don't want to be planting your tomatoes or your peppers because they're in the same family in the same spot. More than we'll talk about crop rotation in a second. But creative use of space. Say you have, um, a 10 by 30 space to plant. You can plant three different things in that same spot in a year. So option one would be something like snap peas in the early spring. You plant them in February or early March, and then by the end of April, the snap peas are done, and you could put cucumbers there. And you plant cucumbers in mid-May, and you're harvesting cucumbers through August, early September, and then in that same spot, you could put kale or collards, up to the late fall, and then you could put in a cover crop. So that's all those things are being planted in the same spot. Option two would be something like cut and come again lettuce, or even heading lettuce that you plant in February or March and you harvest through mid-May, and then you could put in tomatoes. And then when the tomatoes are done in the fall, you could either plant garlic, which is planted in October or November and goes all the way through June, or again, collards or kales or even turnips or beets. For the fall, some of the kale and collards might even overwinter. If you don't want to do a cover crop, you can, let those overwinter. So that's thinking outside the box about, creative use of the space that you have. So crop rotation, right? We've talked about this before. You need to know which family your crops are in so that you move them around. Rotation of crops helps avoid the same plant family in the same location year after year. So you're going to want to use that notebook because I try and I cannot remember where did I plant my tomatoes last year. You want to write it down. Um, you can include cover crops in your rotation. If you have three raised beds, plant cover crops in half of one of them and move that around. Yes, so we say requires seasonal planning and record keeping so you can remember where things go. The most important thing is to know what family your crop is in so that you can rotate that family. Cucurbits is a big family, Solanaceae is a big family. You can also look at it like this. You're rotating roots and fruits and leaves and legumes, right? So you know what your roots are, your fruits, things like tomatoes and squash and melons, rotating with leafy vegetables like spinach or corn or herbs. Nutrients and fertilization. So you want to consider your nutrient needs ahead of time, whether you're going to be purchasing something like in this picture, this pelleted fertilizer, can be organic pelleted fertilizer, or if you are going to buy something like Neptune that you mix in a watering can and water your vegetables. You certainly want to take a soil test and send your soil into NCDA for analysis so you know what you have and don't have. It'll tell you your pH, which affects nutrient availability in your soil. You're gonna oftentimes want to split your nutrients. You add nutrients at planting and then mid-season. Um, your soil, if what you're growing has unique recommendations, your soil test will also tell you that. Things like tomatoes need a little bit of boron. Maybe you have no boron available and you need to add just a little bit, micronutrients, things like that. So soil sample analysis, the NCDA soil testing, it's the most reliable. It's done easily. You can hit up John at NC State or at soil extension offices. They have the boxes that you need and the paperwork to fill out. It's free from April to November, and then after that, it's only $4. They call it peak season from December through March. So we got just a few minutes left. I appreciate you all hanging in with us. If there's any questions that we can answer, I see one that we haven't answered. What type of cloth did you say? I don't know what Margaret, are you referring to like a landscape cover for smothering weeds? You can go ahead and unmute and ask if you like.
It was under the bed, under the raised beds.
Oh, hardware cloth. So
Yeah, hardware.
hardware
I don't
cloth
know
is
what.
it's like a chicken wire, but it's much finer mesh and it's a little more durable.
Okay, so the water can go through that and the roots can go through that as well.
Yes.
Okay, hardware cloth. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a little more expensive than chicken wire, but chicken wire is not going to keep out moles, I don't think. I don't know. We have a lot of moles in our yard. It's a problem.
Yeah, so do we. Thank you.
Yep. Does
Well,
anybody else have a question?
yeah. So if you're welcome to shout it out, put it in the chat now. Otherwise, please, feel free reach either of us through our emails. We'll be happy to help as well. And then one thing I realized we didn't mention is when our next
Hmm.
event date is. So I will probably put sign up registration details for our next lunch and learn, which would be in August, in the follow up from this event. Um, but we do hope that everybody can attend the rest of this series throughout the year. Keeping deer away from the vegetables.
I was going to say it's got to be a tall fence,
There's not a lot of great ways.
but I've also heard that they some of them have motion activated sprinklers that will come on
Hmm.
and scare them. Um, I think there's also sound ones that are like motion activated, a dog barking, that sort of thing. But or a 10-foot fence.
Yeah, and it depends on your resources too, because I've seen people have great success with two tall fences in a row. They can get over one, but they can't gauge
Right.
clearing two. That's a common thing.
Yeah, it confuses
Building,
their eyes too. It confuses them. They think
yeah,
they can't really
yeah.
figure out what's going on.
Um, if you're in the country and it's between October and December. That is an option, but yeah, deer deterrents, there's not really a ton of them. I like trap crops. I like something that they can eat on the far, something a little farther from what you're trying to eat. Bonus points if it's the same thing and you satisfy that, oh, they keep coming in for my squash, so I put a squash plant over here. Like you can do that, but deterring deer is very difficult.
That's
Um,
mulch questions. Someone asked about mulching, best type of mulch for walkways between beds. Wood chips are nice. Wheat straw is also nice, but you want to make sure that you don't incorporate it. I've had that problem. This, you can also make them, depending on the machinery you have, if you make the interrow space wide enough for, say, like a walk behind tiller, you can till there. Wood chips are good, but it's, that's a kind of expensive. Um, Someone mentioned that they use cardboard covered with pine needles, which I think is also good. You need to be careful that the pine needles stay on the cardboard and not in the soil necessarily, because pine needles can reduce your pH.
Mhm. Oh, also, a good thing to be mindful of is the relationship between carbon and nitrogen. If you put something
Right.
down that's very, very heavy in carbon, it might leach nitrogen from the soil. Also, if you use a lot of woody things, you might be inviting in carpenter ants. I've seen people unexpectedly have just a massive amount of carpenter ants because of all the wood or cardboard that they use. So that can be a thing. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and somebody mentioned chip drop as well.
Yep.
That's pretty helpful if you're in the place where you're in within that radius. I want to respect everyone's time. We're at 101. I'm not gonna keep this going too long. Oh, Amy Gregory, welcome, Amy. Mentioned that a blowing windsock man might be able to scare deer. Um, that's kind of cool. Yeah, a lot of times just a weird thing that trips the animals out might be a pretty good deterrent. But we are going to sign off right now. Please stay in touch. Keep an eye out for the follow-up emails, and we hope everyone's able to attend next time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, email us if we didn't get to your question, or if you have additional questions, please feel free to email.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what we're here for. Thank you all so much. We appreciate you. Hope to see you guys and hear from you guys again.
Yep. Take care.
See
See
ya.
y'all. Thanks, Sophie.